great lawyers who can implement, who can write well and communicate well they're not a dime a dozen, but they're relatively common. But the ones who are entrepreneurial, who can go out there and drum up new businessmen, those people are hyper valuable, and they're very rare. But it's also very difficult to nurse them within any system, because systems do not nurture creativity. Not everyone with a high IQ is creative. Lots of lawyers have high IQs, and they tend not to be creative at all. Well, you think about why that is, because lawyers are bound by precedent and rules, and so that isn't the same as being creative. And you want a creative accountant? No, not really. not unless you're looking for a jail sentence. So
they don't like that word at all.
No, yeah, that's right. My creative accountant, wink, wink. Right. So I mean, I psychometrically tested the 100 most creative lawyers in Canada as a project about 15 years ago with a magazine called L'Expert, which was a high prestige magazine among lawyers. And we had lawyers from across the country be nominated by their firms for creativity. And so we got some really, these were outstanding lawyers. So, and we tested them psychometrically, very, very high in intelligence, but not creative at all. The first trait was conscientious, dutiful, hardworking, diligent, industrious, orderly. Because you're working 70 hours a week, and you better bloody well work if you're in a position like that too. So it's nose to the grindstone stuff. Very low in neuroticism, because it's very stressful. So they didn't experience much negative emotion. Very disagreeable people. Well, they're litigators, and so they want to win. They're not compassionate, and they're not polite. And only after that were they open. So they weren't creative at all, but they were extraordinarily intelligent. So,
do employers look for creative people?
No, not generally. Well, it's a real conundrum. So one of the things that's happening right now is that in most businesses, the non-creative people are increasingly being replaced by machines, right? Because anything that's creative can't really be turned into an algorithm that you can run as a machine, but anything that isn't creative can be. And so there's increasing demand in corporations for creative people, but the problem with being creative is that you're useless at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy. Because at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy, so a power hierarchy, you should do what you're told to do. You're not there to think outside the box. You're there to learn what you're supposed to do and implement it. And creative people are that isn't what they do. Now, what happens, though, to companies is that because they filter all the creative people out at the bottom, and then people start to rise up to the top, you really need creative people at the top, because they are the entrepreneurial types, and they're the ones, for example, in law firms, even though lawyers aren't very creative, the more entrepreneurial ones are the ones that bring in all the business. There's great lawyers who can implement, who can write well and communicate well they're not a dime a dozen, but they're relatively common. But the ones who are entrepreneurial, who can go out there and drum up new businessmen, those people are hyper valuable, and they're very rare. But it's also very difficult to nurse them within any system, because systems do not nurture creativity. They're the antithesis of creativity. Because the artist is always the person who stands outside the structure. And so, or maybe builds his or her own structure, which is also why it's hard to evaluate creative people. You can't, really, because if they're operating within the confines of a system that has an evaluative structure, they're not creative. So they're a real pain to try to manage and to organize. But you can select them. You select people who are high in intelligence and high in openness. We've done that in California. So I work with this company called the Founder Institute. It's quite a cool company. It's run by this guy named Hideo Resi, and he has now started schools to foster entrepreneurship in 135 different cities. And so we're testing in 8 languages, and we can reliably select people who will have a functioning business within a year. You select them for high openness and high intelligence, roughly speaking. So it's certainly something you can do. But then you have to figure out what you're going to do with those people, because telling them what to do isn't going to work, and putting them in a box is completely counterproductive. So they're very annoying, even though they're hyper necessary.